In the scorching heat of the Nubian desert, where golden sands meet the life-giving waters of the Nile, a legend was born that would shake the very foundations of the Roman Empire. This is not the story of Caesar or Cleopatra, names that echo through history's halls. This is the tale of a warrior queen whose defiance burned so fierce that even the mighty Augustus himself would be forced to negotiate. Her name was Amanirenas, and she dared to do what no other African ruler had done before. She looked Rome in the eye and declared war. Picture this. The year is 30 BCE. Rome has just conquered Egypt, and Augustus Caesar stands as the most powerful man on earth. His legions have crushed every enemy from Gaul to Germania. The Mediterranean has become a Roman lake. Yet deep in the heart of Africa, beyond the cataracts of the Nile, there exists a kingdom that Rome barely understands. A realm where women rule as equals to men, where gold flows like water, and where warriors have been perfecting the art of war for over 1,000 years. The Romans called it Nubia, but its people knew it as the Kingdom of Kush. This was no primitive frontier territory waiting to be civilized by Roman rule. This was an empire that had once conquered Egypt itself, a civilization that built more pyramids than the pharaohs ever dreamed of constructing. And at its heart sat a queen who would soon teach Rome that African steel could cut just as deep as Roman iron. But to understand how one woman could challenge the greatest empire the world had ever known, we must first journey back to the source of her power. The Kingdom of Kush stretched along the fertile banks of the Nile like a jeweled serpent, its territory spanning from the first cataract in Upper Egypt all the way south to where the blue and white Niles converge. For over 3 millennia, this land had been home to warrior kings and queens who ruled from magnificent capitals that rivaled anything Rome could offer. The kingdom's wealth was legendary. Gold poured from mines scattered across the desert, so abundant that Egyptian pharaohs had once called this region the source of all their riches. Iron ore, harder and more precious than bronze, made Kushite weapons the envy of every army from Libya to Arabia. But perhaps most valuable of all were the people themselves. The Kushites were renowned throughout the ancient world for one thing above all others. They were the finest archers who had ever drawn a bowstring. The very name of their homeland told this story. To the Egyptians, to the Greeks, to anyone who had faced them in battle, this was the land of the bow. Kushite archers could put an arrow through a man's eye at 100 paces. They could loose 20 shafts, while a Roman legionnaire was still drawing his sword. Their composite bows, crafted from horn and sinew, could punch through armor that would turn aside a gladius thrust. When Kushite warriors marched to war, the sky darkened with their arrows like a cloud of locusts descending upon the earth. Yet for all their military might, the Kingdom of Kush possessed something that set it apart from every other civilization of the ancient world. Here, women did not merely influence power from behind palace walls. They seized it with both hands, and wheel they bore was Kandake, which did it like a weapon. The title meant Great Woman, and these were queens who ruled not as consorts or regents, but as absolute monarchs in their own right. The Kandakes of Kush commanded armies, negotiated treaties, and built monuments that proclaimed their glory to the heavens. They wore the double crown of Upper and Lower Kush, carried the titles of both king and queen, and when they rode to battle, enemy armies trembled before their advance. Some ancient writers, witnessing this unprecedented power of women, believed that Kush was ruled entirely by queens. So dominant were these warrior women in the kingdom's affairs. Into this world of gold and iron, of arrows and ambition, Amanirenas was born around 60 BCE. The details of her early life remain shrouded in the mists of time, but we know that she rose to power during one of the most turbulent periods in Mediterranean history. As she grew from princess to queen, the world around her was convulsing with change. In Egypt, the last pharaoh, Cleopatra VII, was fighting desperately to preserve her kingdom's independence. In Rome, Julius Caesar had crossed the Rubicon, and civil war was tearing the republic apart. By the time Amanirenas claimed the title of Kandake, around 40 BCE, she ruled over a kingdom that had successfully maintained its independence for centuries. Unlike Egypt, which had become a Roman client state, Kush remained free, its borders secure, its people unconquered. The new queen inherited not just a crown, but a legacy of resistance that stretched back generations. Her predecessors had faced down Egyptian pharaohs, Persian satraps, and Ptolemaic armies. Now it would be her turn to face the greatest challenge of all. The kingdom she ruled was a wonder to behold. The capital city of Meroë sat like a jewel beside the Nile, its streets bustling with merchants from across Africa and beyond. Massive pyramids rose from the desert sands, their steep sides catching the morning sun and throwing long shadows across the royal necropolis. These were not crude imitations of Egyptian monuments, but distinctly Kushite creations, steeper and more elegant than their northern cousins. Within the city's walls, craftsmen worked precious metals with skills that rivaled anything found in Rome or Alexandria. The royal palace complex sprawled across acres of prime riverfront property, its courtyards adorned with gardens where exotic flowers bloomed year-round. Bathhouses, their pools fed by underground channels, provided cool relief from the desert heat, and in the great audience hall, beneath painted ceilings that depicted the victories of Kushite kings and queens, Amanirenas held court. But the queen's power extended far beyond the luxury of palace life. The Kushite military machine was a force to be reckoned with, built on traditions that had been refined over centuries of warfare. At its core were the legendary archers, men who could draw bows so powerful that lesser warriors could not even string them. These were supported by infantry armed with iron-tipped spears, bronze axes, and shields of hardened oxide that could turn aside the sharpest blade. The cavalry, though smaller in number than their northern rivals, were masters of desert warfare, capable of appearing from nowhere to strike at enemy flanks before vanishing back into the shifting sands. And binding all these forces together was a command structure that placed absolute authority in the hands of the Kandake herself. When Amanirenas gave an order, it was obeyed without question, for her warriors knew that she had earned the right to lead them through blood and victory. Yet even as she consolidated her power within Kush, storm clouds were gathering to the north. In 31 BCE, at the naval battle of Actium, Octavian Caesar had crushed the combined fleets of Mark Antony and Cleopatra, ending the last hope of Egyptian independence. The following year, as Antony and Cleopatra chose death over surrender, Egypt fell under direct Roman rule for the first time in 3 centuries. Augustus Caesar, as Octavian now called himself, wasted no time in reorganizing his newest province. Roman legions marched through Memphis and Thebes, their hobnailed boots echoing on stones that had witnessed the rise and fall of pharaohs. Roman tax collectors spread throughout the Nile Delta, demanding tribute in gold and grain, and Roman administrators began drawing up plans for further expansion, their eyes turning inevitably southward toward the wealthy kingdom that lay beyond the cataracts. For Amanirenas, watching from her palace in Meroë, the writing was on the wall. Rome had devoured every kingdom it had touched. Gaul had fallen to Caesar's legions. Britain trembled before Roman steel. The proud Germanic tribes had been crushed at the Teutoburg forest. Even the mighty Parthian Empire, Rome's only true rival, had been forced to negotiate from a position of weakness. The queen knew that Rome's appetite for conquest was insatiable. Every border was merely a stepping stone to the next campaign. Every treaty was simply a pause between wars. As Roman engineers began surveying the southern reaches of Egypt, measuring distances and calculating supply lines, Amanirenas understood that her kingdom's ancient independence hung by a thread. The Romans had already begun their encroachment with typical imperial arrogance. Heavy taxes were imposed on Nubian merchants trading in Egyptian markets. Kushite envoys were treated with contempt in Alexandria, forced to wait for days before being granted audiences with minor Roman officials. Most insulting of all, Roman administrators began referring to Kush as nothing more than Egypt's southern frontier, a backward region ripe for civilizing under Roman rule. But Augustus had made a critical miscalculation. He assumed that because Kush lay in Africa, beyond the familiar Mediterranean world, it would crumble at the first sight of Roman eagles. He believed that a kingdom ruled by a woman would offer little more resistance than a house of reeds before a hurricane. The emperor had conquered Egypt with ease, after all. How much more difficult could it be to subdue the lands that lay beyond? The answer would come sooner than he expected. In 25 BCE, Augustus ordered Aelius Gallus, the Roman prefect of Egypt, to launch an expedition against the wealthy kingdoms of Arabia. The campaign promised vast riches, spices, and incense that would flow into Roman coffers like rivers of gold. To ensure success, Gallus was authorized to strip Egypt of most of its garrison, taking 3 full legions southward across the Red Sea. As Roman ships disappeared over the horizon, carrying away 15,000 of Rome's finest soldiers, Amanirenas saw her moment. The northern frontier lay virtually undefended, protected by nothing more than scattered auxiliary units and the assumption that no African queen would dare challenge Rome's might. It was time to shatter that assumption with Kushite steel. The queen did not act in haste. This was not the impulsive raid of a desert chieftain, but the carefully orchestrated campaign of a ruler who had spent years studying Roman tactics and weaknesses. Throughout the summer of 25 BCE, messengers rode the desert paths between Meroë and the northern provinces, carrying sealed orders written in the elegant Meroitic script. Weapons were gathered from armories that had been stockpiling iron spearheads and bronze arrow points for generations. Horses were brought down from the eastern highlands, their riders the finest light cavalry in Africa. Most importantly, the great war drums of Kush began to sound. Deep in the royal temples, priests of Aphrodite, the lion-headed god of war, performed rituals that had not been seen for decades. Sacred lions, the living embodiments of the war god himself, paced in their temple enclosures as incense smoke curled toward the heavens. The very air seemed to thrum with anticipation as an entire kingdom prepared for war. By the time the Kushite army assembled on the plains north of Meroë, it numbered 30,000 warriors. This was not merely a collection of tribal fighters, but a professional military force that had been training for this moment their entire lives. At its heart stood the Royal Guard, elite troops whose loyalty to the Kandake was absolute. These men had sworn oaths before the lion god himself, vowing to die before they would retreat from battle. Flanking them were the provincial regiments, each commanded by nobles who traced their bloodlines back to the warrior kings of old. From the eastern deserts came mounted archers who could loose arrows at full gallop with deadly accuracy. From the western highlands marched spearmen whose iron-tipped weapons could punch through the finest mail, and from every corner of the kingdom came the bowmen, thousands upon thousands of archers whose skills had made the land of the bow famous throughout the ancient world. At the head of this magnificent army rode Amanirenas herself, resplendent in royal armor that gleamed like captured sunlight. Her war crown, wrought from Kushite gold and set with precious stones from the kingdom's southern mines, caught every ray of desert light and threw it back in blazing defiance. The queen's horse, a magnificent stallion bred in the royal stables, pranced beneath her as if it too understood the magnitude of the moment. Beside the queen rode her son, Prince Akinidad, young but already proven in the skirmishes that marked Kush's turbulent borders. The prince carried his own bow, crafted from the finest horn and sinew, and his quiver bristled with arrows fletched with eagle feathers. Mother and son together embodied the royal line of Kush, a dynasty that had never bowed before foreign conquerors and would not begin now. As the great army moved northward along the Nile, following the ancient roads that connected Meroë to the wider world, word of its approach spread like wildfire through the river villages. Farmers abandoned their fields to watch the procession pass, their eyes wide with wonder at the sight of so many warriors marching under the royal banners. Children climbed date palms and acacia trees to catch glimpses of their legendary queen, while old men who remembered the stories of previous campaigns nodded knowingly to one another. The Kushite advance was deliberately visible, designed to strike fear into Roman hearts and rally support from the local population. These lands between Egypt and Kush had changed hands many times over the centuries, and the people who lived there understood that their survival depended on backing the winning side. As news of the approaching army reached the scattered Roman garrisons, panic began to set in. The few Roman officers left behind by Gallus found themselves commanding forces that were pitifully inadequate for the task at hand. Most of their troops were auxiliary units recruited from local populations, men whose loyalty to Rome was questionable at best when faced with a Kushite army led by their own queen. Desperate messages were sent south, begging Gallus to return with his legions, but the prefect was already deep in the Arabian desert, chasing mirages of easy conquest. By the time Amanirenas reached the first cataract, the traditional boundary between Egypt and Nubia, her army had swollen to massive proportions. Local chieftains had joined her cause, bringing their own warriors and intimate knowledge of the terrain. Nubian merchants who had suffered under Roman taxation eagerly offered their services as guides and suppliers. Even some Egyptian natives, resentful of their new Roman masters, began to see the Kushite queen as a potential liberator. The queen's first target was carefully chosen for maximum psychological impact. The island fortress of Philae, sacred to the goddess Isis and strategically positioned to control river traffic, had been fortified by the Romans as a key strongpoint in their southern defenses. Its capture would not only eliminate a major obstacle to the Kushite advance, but would also send a clear message that no Roman position was safe from African wrath. The assault on Philae began before dawn, when the desert air still held the coolness of night and mist clung to the sacred waters of the Nile. Amanirenas had positioned her forces with the precision of a master tactician, understanding that this first blow must be devastating not just in its success, but in its swiftness. Roman confidence depended on the myth of their invincibility, and myths could be shattered by a single, perfectly executed strike. The island fortress seemed impregnable in the grey, pre-dawn light, its walls rising directly from the river like extensions of the rock itself. Roman sentries paced the ramparts, their torches flickering in the gentle breeze, unaware that death was already gliding toward them across the dark water. Kushite warriors, their bodies blackened with charcoal and moving with the silence of hunting cats, had spent the night crossing the Nile on reed boats, so light they barely disturbed the surface. When the attack came, it was like lightning splitting the morning sky. The first Roman guard died with a Kushite arrow through his throat before he could cry out. The second fell to a spear thrust that came from shadows he never saw. By the time the garrison realized they were under assault, half their number lay dead in pools of spreading blood, and Kushite war cries were echoing off the temple walls. The defenders fought bravely, but they were facing an enemy unlike anything in their experience. These were not the disorganized tribal raids they had been trained to repel, but the coordinated assault of a professional army that had been perfecting siege warfare for centuries. Kushite archers, positioned on the mainland, sent volleys of arrows arcing over the walls with such precision that Roman soldiers found themselves pinned in their own courtyards. Meanwhile, assault teams scaled the fortress walls using techniques learned in countless border conflicts. Within 2 hours of the first arrow's flight, the banner of Kush flew over Philae. The surviving Romans, those who had been wise enough to surrender when the battle turned hopeless, found themselves facing a queen whose reputation for both mercy and ruthlessness preceded her. Amanirenas, still mounted on her war horse, studied the prisoners with eyes that missed nothing. These men had served an empire that viewed her people as nothing more than potential slaves to be harvested at will. What happened next would become legend throughout the ancient world. Rather than execute her captives, as Roman generals routinely did with defeated enemies, Amanirenas made a different choice. She ordered the prisoners to be treated with the honor due to brave soldiers, their wounds tended by Kushite healers who possessed medical knowledge that rivaled anything found in Rome. But she also made certain they understood the message she was sending to their emperor. The Roman standards captured in the fortress were not destroyed, but carefully preserved as trophies of war. More significantly, the bronze statues of Augustus that the Romans had erected throughout their newly conquered province became the focus of a ritual that spoke to the very heart of imperial power. One by one, these monuments to Roman authority were torn down by Kushite warriors who understood the symbolic importance of their actions. The destruction was methodical and deliberate. Augustus, who had proclaimed himself the son of a god, watched helplessly from his bronze pedestals as Kushite axes reduced his image to scattered fragments. But Amanirenas was not content with mere destruction. She ordered the finest of these statues, a magnificent bronze head that had been crafted by Rome's most skilled artisans, to be carefully preserved and transported south to Meroë. This trophy would serve a purpose far greater than simple victory celebration. In the capital of Kush, beneath the steps of a temple dedicated to victory itself, the head of Augustus would be buried where every visitor to the sacred precinct would unknowingly tread upon the image of Rome's greatest emperor. It was a gesture of contempt so profound that it would have driven Augustus into apoplectic rage had he known of it, and one that perfectly captured the Kushite view of Roman pretensions to divine authority. With Philae secured, the queen's army moved north with the confidence of hunters who had tasted first blood. The next targets fell in rapid succession, each victory building momentum like an avalanche gathering speed down a mountainside. Syene, the great trading city that controlled the flow of goods between Egypt and Nubia, opened its gates after a brief siege that demonstrated the futility of resistance. Elephantine, the fortress island that had guarded Egypt's southern frontier for centuries, surrendered when its garrison realized they were facing not raiders but conquerors. At each captured city, the pattern repeated with devastating effectiveness. Roman officials were taken prisoner, their archives seized to provide intelligence about enemy positions and resources. Local populations, many of whom had chafed under the heavy taxation imposed by their new Roman masters, greeted the Kushite army as liberators rather than invaders. Most importantly, the material wealth of 3 major Roman strongholds flowed south toward Meroë, funding further military operations and demonstrating to potential allies that defying Rome could be profitable as well as satisfying. The psychological impact of these victories rippled outward from the battle zone like waves from a stone dropped in still water. Throughout Egypt, Roman administrators who had grown comfortable in their assumption of permanent superiority suddenly found themselves looking over their shoulders. Auxiliary troops, recruited from local populations and commanded by Roman officers who often treated them with open contempt, began to question whether their loyalty was being placed with the winning side. Most critically, news of the Kushite successes began to reach other African kingdoms that had been watching Roman expansion with growing alarm. From the kingdoms of Libya to the tribes of the Western Desert, rulers who had been considering submission to Roman demands suddenly saw a different path forward. If a single African queen could humble the legions of Augustus, perhaps the Roman Empire was not as invincible as its propaganda claimed. But Amanirenas was too experienced a commander to let success breed overconfidence. Even as her warriors celebrated their victories and counted their spoils, the queen was already planning the next phase of her campaign. Intelligence gathered from captured Roman documents revealed the true weakness of enemy positions throughout southern Egypt, but it also confirmed what she had suspected from the beginning. Aelius Gallus and his 3 legions would eventually return from Arabia, and when they did, the nature of this conflict would change dramatically. The queen understood that her current advantages were temporary. Speed, surprise, and the weakness of Roman garrison forces had given her the initiative. But she could not maintain that advantage indefinitely against an empire with virtually unlimited resources. What she needed was not just military victory, but a political settlement that would secure Kushite independence for generations to come, and that would require forcing Augustus himself to treat her as an equal rather than a rebellious subject. The opportunity came sooner than expected. Word reached the Kushite camp that Gallus had abandoned his Arabian adventure, his forces decimated by desert warfare and disease, and was racing north with the survivors of his expeditionary force. The Roman prefect had finally grasped the magnitude of the crisis developing on his own doorstep, but his response revealed the fundamental misunderstanding that plagued Roman thinking about African opponents. Gallus believed he was facing a tribal uprising that could be crushed through the application of superior Roman discipline and tactics. His plan was straightforward in its simplicity. He would concentrate his remaining forces at a single strongpoint, force the Kushites to attack prepared positions, and use Roman engineering and heavy infantry to break their assault. It was a strategy that had worked countless times against Celtic warriors, Germanic tribes, and Gallic chieftains. Against the Kandake of Kush, it would prove to be a catastrophic miscalculation. The confrontation came at Dakka, a fortified town that commanded one of the few reliable crossing points on this stretch of the Nile. Gallus had chosen his position well from a tactical standpoint, occupying high ground that gave his archers clear fields of fire while forcing any attacker to advance across open terrain. His engineers had worked frantically to improve the natural defenses, digging trenches and constructing palisades that would channel enemy forces into killing zones. And so ends the tale of Amanirenas, the one-eyed queen who dared to stand against the mightiest empire the world had ever known. She proved that courage knows no borders, that defiance burns brightest in the darkest hour, and that sometimes, just sometimes, The underdog can force even emperors to negotiate. Her legacy echoes still, a reminder that true power lies not in conquest, but in the unbreakable will to remain free.